It was Halloween night. I was in 7th grade, getting ready to go trick-or-treating with my friends. We lived in a small town that bordered between suburban and rural, so our journey would consist of traveling across property, widespread neighborhoods in order to get our candy. I was at my friend's house, we'll call her Caitlin, waiting for the other two to show up. Since our group consisted of 2 boys and 2 girls, we thought it'd be fun to go as Scooby-Doo, or at least the Scooby-Doo gang, I should say. I was Velma, Caitlin was Daphne. My other friends, whom we'll call Alex and Josh, dressed as Shaggy and Fred. We even planned on bringing Josh's Great Dane with us so she could be Scooby. But his mom wasn't really cool with that. Looking back now, I understand. I wouldn't trust a bunch of 12-year-olds with the responsibility of handling a massive dog for hours upon hours either. Josh showed up at around 4:30. Alex arrived about 15 minutes after him. We were out the door a bit before 5. At what I guess was around 6:30, Alex stopped moving after we finished our most recent house. I asked him what was wrong, and he said he felt like we were too old to be doing this, and that it felt a bit lame. I asked if he had any better ideas. As it turned out, he did. Since we lived in the South, we had a legend of haunted woods nearby. Allegedly, they were filled with the ghosts of slaves who had been hung there. Before I could even make a decision on whether or not I wanted to go, my 2 other friends agreed. It was dark by now, and we started heading our way towards the woods. We began to stray further and further away from the light that the street lamps provided us, and I wasn't as scared of ghosts as much as I was paranoid about getting lost. We had brought a couple of flashlights with us, so we'd be able to see. But entering in an old area, tall trees all around, you can make a group of kids easily get confused on what direction they were really headed. We tread through the woods, not really finding anything significant. Josh decided to call out for the ghosts, and Caitlin, who was horribly superstitious, told him to stop, and that if the spirits were to talk to us, they needed to come on their own accord and not be disturbed. I was just getting bored, and part of me wanted to make an excuse that I was scared so we can go back to trick-or-treating. Then, in the distance, we heard the sounds of twigs breaking and leaves being crunched under somebody's feet. We followed the noises to check out what was going on. Well, as it turned out, it was just a doe, and she ran off as soon as she came into the line of sight. However, she led us to something much more interesting. In the distance, we could make out the shape of a large old abandoned house. It was in very bad shape, though, to the point where most of the roof had collapsed in on itself. Alex mentioned how it must have been a plantation at one point in time, and if that was the case, we were probably in the most haunted area the woods could offer. So, in response, Josh called out for the spirits again. We heard what sounded like a brick being dropped onto the ground. It was only then that I started to get scared. Josh seemed excited and began to move closer to the house. We followed, with great hesitance on my part. We shone our flashlights into the house, but nothing was to be seen. Josh called out once more, asking if the spirit was a slave. That's when we heard a deep, low, grumbling growl. Caitlin began to panic at this point, saying there was a demon here and that we needed to get out as soon as possible. Before we knew it, we saw a pair of 2 glowing red eyes appear from the dark. We all began to book, screaming as we made our way back into the woods. I don't want to be alone, so I just followed Alex wherever he was going. I had no idea where Josh and Caitlin were. I heard Caitlin screaming in the distance, so I called out for her, but she didn't respond, just continued to scream. I then looked around, realizing I had lost track of Alex. I didn't have either flashlight, so I couldn't make out anything but trees around me. I then heard footsteps running my way, and I was about to take off before I realized it was just Caitlin. She was full on bawling and said we had to go. Some feet away, I can make out the red glowing eyes once again. We sprinted, and I trailed behind her, taking a moment to look back, just to see what the thing looked like. I didn't know what I expected, but it didn't look ghostly at all. In fact, the closest thing I could narrow it down to was a werewolf, as it had a vaguely human shape and was standing up on its 2 legs. But its overall appearance was that of a dog's. It was huge, at least 3 times the size of Josh's Great Dane. I know that sounds preposterous, but I promise, this thing was massive. Part of me wondered if this was just some elaborate costume or prank, but I know this thing looked far too real for that to be the case. The texture of its fur, the faint supernatural glow of its eyes, and the way its body moved when it breathed, all seemed too evident toward its authenticity. This was a living, wild beast. It began to walk towards us, and I continued to sprint, changing directions, hoping to lose this thing. It worked, but I had no idea where Caitlin went. I hid behind a tree, trying my best to quiet my gasps for air. Through the moonlight that made its way through the trees along with the glowing of the animal's eyes, I could spot it stopping in its tracks before going down onto all 4s, seemingly trying to sniff out an area for who could be nearby. It moved its head in my direction, and I swore for a moment that we met eyes. I ducked back behind the tree as best I could. I heard this dog shuffle around and let out another low growl, seemingly knowing I was there. I wanted to cry, but I was too scared of making any more noise. Then, I heard the sound of an engine roar nearby, and it wasn't long before a car with bright lights came zooming past the trees. It was enough to startle the dog creature and make it run back in the direction it came, or so I thought. Knowing I was near the road, I went past the trees and onto the pavement, waving my hands around to try and get the attention of whatever upcoming drivers I could. I heard a quiet, "There's Maggie," come from the distance, and Josh and Alex approached me, asking where Caitlin was. I answered that she was just with me, but I couldn't find her. We heard more twigs snapping and a screech come from the woods, so loud that it echoed into the entire sky. It was followed by Caitlin's scream. Alex flagged down the next car, and we called for Caitlin as we climbed in, keeping the doors open so she could hear us. Her screams got closer and closer until she finally appeared from the woods and leapt into the car, atop of me and Josh. We slammed in the car and slammed the door shut and demanded the driver to go. This dog creature, I don't even know what you'd call it, leapt out of the woods, standing in plain sight, fully exposed by the car's brake lights. It was even more terrifying now, having a clear view of it and being up close. We all turned around and saw this thing's ferocity on its face. We all screamed and the driver took off. This creature got back down on all 4s and began chasing after us, the driver hitting the accelerator so hard that the entire car was vibrating. Eventually, though, it was speedy enough to make it far away from that dog thing, and I watched out the back window as the figure disappeared back into the darkness, the only sight being its glowing red eyes growing smaller and smaller. Now, I don't know if this thing purposefully stopped following us, because I felt like it was large enough and powerful that it easily could have kept up with our car if it really wanted to. The driver asked us what the hell just happened, and we replied that we didn't know. He said that as soon as we got to his house, he was going to phone the police. Upon arriving, we waited on the couch, not knowing what to do. We didn't talk about it at all. In fact, none of us wanted to. While waiting for the police to arrive, the driver let us take turns calling our parents and letting them know what happened. None of us tried to give too many details. For the most part, our parents were angry that we wandered off from our destination. My folks told me that I'd be getting a stern talk once I got home, which I knew was just code word for being grounded. The police arrived, we made our statements, and not much happened after that. except our parents coming to pick us up. Like I predicted, I was grounded, but my parents were mostly just glad that I was safe. Some years after the event, Caitlin and I were discussing that night. We decided to go back to the woods after school, while it was still light out, just to see if it was still there. I think by this point, we'd rationalized that it was just a guy pulling a prank, considering I heard nothing new come about after speaking to the police. Caitlin and I weren't friends with Josh and Alex anymore. It wasn't anything too serious. It was just that we naturally drifted apart over time. They had their group of guy friends and were doing their own thing now. So, it was just me and her. Since we were old enough to drive at this point, we took ourselves there, stepping out of the car and quietly walking in the woods. We had cell phones, unlike last time, although the service wasn't that great out where we were. Caitlin also had brought her bear spray that she stole from her stepdad. We went back to the place where the plantation house was, and it was in far worse shape than I remembered. In one of the areas where the wall collapsed in on itself, we took a look inside. There wasn't much to see, until I noticed a series of massive paw prints indented into dried mud. Caitlin and I took one look at each other, and although we didn't say anything, we made a mutual agreement. These paw prints were easily double the size of Josh's Great Dane. How do I remember that? Because sometimes he would walk his Great Dane with us when we'd hang out, and I was always amazed by the size of his dog's paw prints and how large they were. These were easily double that size. They were huge. Even though it was daytime, at this point, we didn't trust that we wouldn't stumble upon something that we shouldn't. So, we walked away from the site, went back through where we came from, and drove off. I've since moved pretty far away from there, but last I heard, that whole house was properly torn down a couple of years after I graduated high school. I find it almost funny, reflecting back on it now, because the only reason we'd ever gone into those woods in the first place was to find spirits that lurked the plantation. Little did we know, we'd stumble across something far, far worse. I don't believe in werewolves, but I can't deny that this creature didn't resemble that, straight out of something that you'd expect to see out of a movie. Now, I can't really tell a lot of people about this because they won't believe me, and will write it off as just a ghost story, or some sort of scary story. But I and my friends will always live with this true encounter of some sort of creature that we witnessed.